Hey guys, welcome to this video. We're going to talk about a very common violation, which is false credit reporting by debt collectors. So when you have a debt collector that does false credit reporting, this will violate the FDCPA. We'll also talk a little bit about disputing this under the FCRA, the Fair Credit Reporting Act. But the majority of what we'll talk about is the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act. So let's go to the FDCPA, Fair Debt Collection Practices Act, Section 1692E. So here's the general principle. A debt collector may not use any false, deceptive, or misleading representation or means in connection with the collection of any debt. So let's focus on this. It's an absolute prohibition, may not use. Well, is it some false, some deceptive, some... No, it's any false, deceptive, or misleading representation or means in connection with the collection of what type of debts? Any debts. Now, you still have to meet the definition of debt or consumer debt under the FDCPA to qualify, but it's saying as long as it's a consumer debt that meets that definition, then any debt. So in other words, sometimes debt collectors will say, well, I think we ought to be able to do this on medical debt, and that should be excluded. Nope, it's any debt. Well, I don't think this should apply to student loans. Any debt. So it's an absolute prohibition. You cannot use anything false, deceptive, or misleading collecting a debt. And then what I have in brackets is just saying, look, that's the general principle. Now we'll see some examples. These are merely examples. These are not the entirety of what a violation would be. So let's look at two examples here. So subsection 2, false representation of the character, amount, or legal status of any debt. So what do we mean by this? Well, let's say that a debt collector says that you owe a debt and you really don't. Well, then that would be a false representation of the character, amount, legal status. Let's say they tell you that there's a judgment and there's really not a judgment. There's a lawsuit, but there's no judgment. Well, that would be a false representation. That would be deceptive. If they say that you owe $10,000 and really you owe $8,000, well, that's a false representation of the amount. So again, they're using language that's very broad to say anything that's false about this would qualify. And then we have this specific section 8, communicating. So let's read it this way. Communicating to any person credit information which is known to be false. Okay, that makes sense. If they communicate something and they know it's false and it's about your credit, so in other words, it shows up on your credit report, that's a simple example. That would definitely be credit information. But what about if they merely threaten to communicate to a credit bureau information that they know is false? Well, that would be a violation as well. So we sued one time, Portfolio Recovery, I believe it was, because this was a debt that was, let's say, 10 years after we defaulted. And they said, we may report this to the credit bureaus. What do you mean you may report it? You can only report it for 7 years, or depending on how you count it, maybe 7.5 years. Certainly not 10 years. And so they threatened to report something that they knew that they couldn't do. Well, that would be false. Plus, we didn't owe the debt in the first place. So if they communicate or they threaten to communicate something that they know to be false, then that's wrong. But it's not just that they know to be false. Look at what we have highlighted in green. Or which should be known to be false. So let's say a debt collector, you pay them money and they acknowledge you paid off the debt. And then they report you to the credit bureaus that you owe a balance. Well, they know that that's false. Well, what if they get paid by you, but they never send you a letter acknowledging that? And then they report that you owe a balance to the credit bureau. And you sue them, and they go, well, we didn't know that you paid us. I mean, you did pay us, but we didn't know it. Well, we would say, you should have known that this was false. Or this happens a lot. They sue us, we beat them in the lawsuit, and they continue to report it to the credit bureaus, saying that we owe this money. And they say, well, we didn't know that was false. Well, you sued us and you lost. And they're like, well, you can't expect us to keep up with all the lawsuits we filed and whether we win or lose them, do you? Like, yeah, we do expect you to do that. So if they know it, or they should know it, like they check their own files, they check with the creditor if you disputed it or requested validation, verification. So all of that would violate the law. But look at this last part. And this gives us some insight here. It's any false information. And here, false information means not simply what they reported, is that true or false? If it's false, then that's wrong. But it's the failure to communicate that a disputed debt is disputed. And I've had lawyers argue for debt collectors, say, well, I don't think that that's really false. I mean, yes, you disputed it. And yes, we did not report that to the credit bureau, but everything we said was true. It's like, yes, but you can lie by omission. So you can misrepresent something and you affirmatively state something that is untrue, but you can also suppress or omit or hide the truth. And if the debt collector knows or should know that you've disputed the debt, which could be done verbally, by the way, then they have to tell the credit bureaus that. They have to show it as being disputed. Now, some courts say only if they update the report after you dispute it. Okay? But the point is that when they tell the credit bureau something, they better be honest and they better give the full picture here. So what are some conclusions? If you see a debt collector on your credit report, then you should say, is there anything false or incomplete about this? And let's back that up even one step. If a debt collector is threatening to credit report, say, well, what they're threatening to credit report, is that false or incomplete? So how about the balance owed? How about the dates? Maybe you made a payment. Maybe you're making a series of payments to the collector. Are those on there correctly? And let's just take a step back. Should it be on your report at all? I mean, do you owe it? Or did you do a pay for delete where you pay them $1,000 and they say, all right, we'll delete this from your credit report? Well, then it shouldn't be on there at all. Now, have you disputed it verbally or in writing? Now, you'll know from some of our other videos that there are certain things you have to do in writing. So if you want a cease and desist, that has to be in writing. Can't just be verbal. To get the full effect of it, it needs to be in writing. How about if you get a debt validation letter from the debt collector and you write back in dispute and you request verification? Well, that has to be in writing. But just to dispute it, you can do that verbally. If you dispute it, then we say, has the account been updated after the dispute? Because, again, some courts think that's the law. And if they've updated it after your verbal dispute, does it show disputed or not? Usually that's in the comment section. And particularly if you did it in writing, that makes it very easy. Does it show that it's disputed? Now, let's say you get that debt validation notice from the collector and within 30 days you dispute and you request validation, verification of it. Was that ignored? But they still continue to credit report. Well, that may be a violation of 1692G, and it would, but it may also be a violation of 1692E because they're putting false information out there. So then you ask yourself, okay, if I know this is false or it's incomplete, should I dispute under the FCRA, Fair Credit Reporting Act? And when you dispute under there, you go directly to the credit reporting agencies. And then if you sue, under what law should you sue? Okay. Well, you can only sue under the Fair Credit Reporting Act if you've disputed through the credit bureaus. And then they notify the debt collector, called a furnisher, because they furnish information to the credit bureaus. And then the furnisher says, keep that information on there. Don't delete it or update it and it's still false. Well, then you would have an FCRA claim. So this will be reviewed for a lot of you guys. I'll just go through it quickly. For the FDCPA to apply, you've got to be a consumer, got to be consumer debt, got to be dealing with a debt collector. We look at the definition under 1692A to figure all this out. And then we need the violation of the FDCPA. Here we would have lying. Okay, they lied. Now, we might also have some other sections, but under Section E, we're talking about lying. So 4 requirements for the Fair Credit Reporting Act to apply to a debt collector. You need false information. You've got to dispute that through the credit reporting agencies. That's Equifax, Experian, TransUnion. Those are often called the CRAs, for credit or consumer reporting agencies. Then, when you make that dispute directly to the credit reporting agency, it has to notify the debt collector. So if it doesn't, then there's no liability under the FCRA for the debt collector, but there'd be liability under the consumer reporting agency. And then the debt collector has to tell the credit reporting agency, don't delete, instead verify, which is say it's all right, or update it, but they put false information with it. Now, you might can sue the credit reporting agency depending on how you do the dispute, but I'm just focused on the debt collector here. So those would be the requirements to sue the debt collector. False information, you dispute it through the credit bureaus, they notify the collector, and the collector does not fix it. Well, what do you get if you sue? So you get actual or compensatory damages. That's to bring you back to where you were before these guys violated the law. Statutory damages under the FDCPA can be up to $1,000. Under the Fair Credit Reporting Act, if it's a reckless or intentional violation, then it can be up to $1,000 per violation. FDCPA is per case, but the FCRA, Fair Credit Reporting Act, is per violation. Get attorney's fees. So the bad guys have to pay for your attorneys. Bad guys have to pay for costs of litigation. And then can you get punitive damages, not under the FDCPA, but maybe a state law, invasion of privacy, defamation. But if you sued under the Fair Credit Reporting Act and you sued for reckless or intentional violation of the FCRA, then you can get punitive damages, which is to punish and to deter this debt collector and all other debt collectors from ever doing this again. So thanks for watching this video. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to put those below or get with me directly. And if you have suggestions for other types of violations that debt collectors do that you'd like me to cover, just put those in the comments and I'll be happy to put those on the list and we'll get that knocked out. Okay, thanks guys. Appreciate you watching this video. Bye-bye.